This demonstration will cover the sixth and final main step in the process of constructing a hand drawing. With our simple skeleton in place, our next step is to take a look at the contour, the shape of the outline of our reference hand, and plan how we're going to draw it around the skeleton. Unlike in cartoons, objects in real life don't have nice black outlines around them. Consciously or unconsciously, we're seeing differences in color, shape, brightness, and focus, and using those to distinguish between objects and other objects, or objects and their surroundings. When we're drawing, it can be helpful to have an outline to define the boundary between the positive space of our subject, in this case the gray shading of our reference hand, and the negative space around it, which would just be the white space of the page. So for our planning process, we're actually going to set our skeleton aside and take a look just at our reference hand. So we know that our skeleton has circles for a lot of the joints in the hand. So that would seem to be one logical way of dividing up the contour. We could make a mark here, divide it into segments by joint. And for the most part, that works okay. But another way of looking at it is to look for discrete shapes. And so what I mean by that are three basic line shapes. A straight line, self-explanatory, although there aren't a lot of perfectly straight lines in the human form. A convex curve, which is one that bulges outward in relation to the subject, or a concave curve, which is one that sort of divots in relation to the subject. So I'm going to use sort of a hybrid approach as I make my tick marks to divide the contour into segments. So wrist to palm, and that's an easy division to make right there. Instead of having kind of a wavy curve, I'm going to put a tick mark here, and a tick mark here, because the shape of the curve changes enough that it's worth doing as separate segments. We switch from concave to convex here. And for a lot of the rest of these, the joint is a good place to split the outline into segments. You're looking for a change in the type of shape. Now this is another one where it's really basically one long curve, so I'm going to skip that joint. Make a tick mark there. Now it's up to you if you do this part mentally, just by looking at the reference hand, or if you want to print out a copy and actually draw your own tick marks. Some people have an easier time doing it mentally, other people like to have it written out on the page. For the purposes of explaining it, I'm obviously doing the tick marks here, but it's up to you which way you choose to do it. Either way, once you've got the contour segmented, what we're doing next is taking a closer look at the shape of each individual line segment. So there are two types of comparisons that I think are useful here, absolute and relative. Absolute would be looking at a perfect shape, a perfectly straight line, or a perfect, or as close as I can do freehand, circle, and comparing your line segment to that absolute shape. So how close is the forearm here to a perfectly straight line? Well, it's pretty close. Close enough that, for a drawing where it doesn't need to be absolutely perfect, a straight line is good. How about this curve? How close is that to the arc of part of a circle? Well, it's pretty close, so that can help me figure out how to draw that shape. So that's absolute. Relative would be not comparing segments to perfect shapes, but comparing them to each other. So how long is this curve as opposed to this curve? Well, this segment is a little bit longer than this one, so I know when I draw it, I need to make sure that this ends up being longer. This curve is also a little bit shallower, so I need to make sure this one is a little more pronounced when I draw it. This curve is convex, it's bulging outward. This one is concave, it goes in. So I need to keep that relationship in mind. And it's going through and doing that, so comparing to absolute shapes and doing relative comparisons to other segments to plan, okay, what shapes am I going to have to draw? This one is actually an S-curve, but it's really shallow, so it's not something like that. It's just a very gentle curve. The curves around the fingers are a little bit irregular. gentle S curve there, same thing there. So you'd go through around the whole reference hand and figure out for each particular segment, what's the shape going to be like? Now, should you look at the entire hand and then do your drawing? It's up to you. I think it's good to at least look at the entire outline of the hand first. But then when you do your actual drawing, it can be helpful, just to focus on one segment at a time. Look at the reference hand, look at your page, look at your reference hand, look back at your page. These are all just very gentle convex curves. One long one, and then concave to finish us off. So that's our very rough plan for how to approach the contour drawing. So now that we've done that, I'm going to take our reference hand away and put our skeleton back. And the approach I like to take for this, I will very lightly sketch a few lines to try and get the general shape down on paper. And, I'll compare that to the reference hand, and then once I get something that I'm okay with, I will then draw a little bit of a darker line on top of it. And then, I might go back and erase the sketch lines. And that can be a little bit easier than trying to draw it freehand, even, with the planning that we did and even with the skeleton. So I'm just sort of sketching based on the plan, looking at the shape. We've got that S curve, and then a nice bulge around this joint. And then we've got that long convex curve, comes up around there and then dips in because we've got that wrinkle on the thumb. And that's a bit pointier than our reference hand. So the magic of working digitally instead of erasing, I'm just going to Control Z and make that less pointy. There we go. So we've got a bulge here between the joints. Then we sort of curve up along line A and round over that joint. And the rest of these, I'll just do freehand for the sake of time. This was one long segment, sort of a shallow curve. One of the interesting differences between people's hands is, where these bulges and wrinkles are. And we all have wrinkles that would result in, very little bumps on the side of the contour if I were doing that level of detail. But the bulges, where fat and other tissue is stored on our hands, is one of the things you can use to differentiate one person's hand from another. We only have the one reference hand here that we're looking at. But it's one of those, almost like fingerprints. Everybody's hand has its own specific pattern. Now I'm going to sketch this one just because longer lines are trickier to get right than shorter ones. So having the sketch guide there is really helpful. And then we'll finish it off with just the gentle curve of the forearm. And with that, we've got our contour drawing. Now, it's definitely not an exact copy of the reference hand. And I can actually throw up the reference hand so you can see, there are places where it's off. But it's definitely a good bit closer than it would have been without all the prep work we did to get us here. For the segments that are particularly off, we can go back and erase them and redraw. Making those sorts of corrections and adjustments is a normal part of the process. I would just say that we don't want to get so caught up in that we lose sight of the fun of drawing. This is supposed to be this wonderful creative process that you enjoy. So you definitely need to remember to have fun with it. It is worth noting that while the contour drawing is the last step of our constructive process, it isn't the final step in actually drawing the hand. To turn this into a finished drawing, there are a few more stages we'd work through, but I'll save those for the subject of a different lesson.